Hello and welcome. Between 1980 and 1981, Alan Moore wrote 5 stories for Doctor Who magazine, published by Marvel UK. So they represent some very early, mainstream work by Moore. It has to be presumed there was heavy editorial input, especially during this period of Doctor Who history. After all, this was near the end of the highly popular Tom Baker era, and, presumably, BBC would have been quite protective of this successful property. Allegedly, Moore was allowed to use any of the Whovian rogues gallery, except for the Doctor himself and the Daleks. The Doctor appears to have been reserved for the main feature, so it makes sense that he wouldn't appear in 2 conflicting stories within the same magazine. As for the Daleks, they are a fiercely protected property that are not owned by the BBC, as one might presume. They are currently owned by the estate of the creator, Terry Nation, so their usage would require special permission. Thus the reason they weren't available for the short backup features Moore supplied. As another interesting aside, the main feature, featuring the Doctor himself, were all written by Steve Moore, also known as Pedro Henry, a collaborator on Moore's early underground stories, and they were all drawn by Dave Gibbons, the artist of Watchmen. The first Doctor Who story written by Alan Moore was Black Legacy. It was illustrated by David Lloyd, who would later collaborate with Moore on V for Vendetta. In fact, all of but one of these Doctor Who stories would be illustrated by Lloyd. The story involves the Cybermen investigating a long-dead civilization, hoping to discover useful weapons to use in their conquests. During the process, the Cybermen experience terrifying visions, and, one by one, they begin to die. This is the result of an apocalypse device, one that was responsible for destroying the ancient civilization that created it. This 8-page story ran as 4 2-page installments. It was literally the final feature in the very back of Doctor Who Weekly for the month of June 1980. Notably, the apocalypse device in this story bears some similarity to the Fury, the robot from Captain Britain. Both are indestructible, unstoppable, and focused on one goal. The second story was Business as Usual. It's another 8-part story told in 2-page installments, published through the month of July 1980. This involves an attempted Auton invasion of Earth disguised as a business venture. Due to some industrial espionage, the evil plot naturally fails, but there is a slight future shock twist ending that suggests the story might not be over. Critically speaking, this is an action thriller with a light suggestion that corporations only exist for devious purposes. It's skillfully managed and well-paced. It shows that Moore can tell a rather concise, complete story in very few pages. The final 3 stories are all related, and amount to the beginning of an overall, larger story that takes place in the early days of the Doctor Who mythos. At this point, the Doctor Who magazine dropped from being a weekly periodical to being published monthly. As a result, the backup feature was expanded to 4 pages, rather than 2. So, over 12 pages in total, Moore establishes a premise that he never has a chance to explore. The first part, Star Death, was illustrated by John Stokes. It takes place at the point where the Gallifreyans are gathering the energy that will allow them to become Time Lords. Unfortunately, there is an attempted sabotage by Fenris, a mercenary from 30,000 years in the future. His attempt to stop the Gallifreyans from mastering time is prevented, and he ends up trapped for eternity in a time vortex. The next part, 4D War, moves ahead 20 years and focuses on Rema Du, the Time Lord in charge of retrieving Fenris from the time vortex. She teams up with War Dog of the Special Executive to accomplish this task. It's learned that the Time Lords are fighting an enemy from the future, the Order of the Black Sun, and they are already involved in a time war that has yet to begin. Notably, one of Moore's recurring writing techniques is gently represented. The story begins with Rema Du walking towards the reader, her boots making a distinct noise on the floor. This segment ends with her walking away from the reader, her footsteps making the same signature noise. In other words, the ending echoes the beginning. This is a trait that becomes quite pronounced in Moore's work for DC. The final story, Black Sun Rising, takes place 10 years after the prior chapter and once again stars Rema Du and War Dog of the Special Executive. Rema Du begins a romantic relationship with a member of the Black Sun, but, due to Sontaran interference, this relationship meets a tragic ending. While not explicit, it's reasonable to presume this is the beginning or motivation behind the war between the Time Lords and the Order of the Black Sun. Moore did have further stories planned and intended to continue with this premise. Unfortunately, changes at the magazine forced him to quit writing the backup feature. Reportedly, Steve Moore was unceremoniously removed as the writer of the lead comic feature. Due to this, Moore discontinued working for the magazine. On principle, he couldn't work for a company that unfairly treated the person who was instrumental in Moore getting the Doctor Who work. Not to mention, they were friends and had worked together in the past, so it was a show of solidarity and a protest over the treatment of another fellow creator. The trilogy of short stories introduces War Dog and the Special Executive. These characters would go on to be used in Captain Britain when Moore took over control of that title. As mentioned earlier, the Apocalypse device also bears similarity to the Fury, a silent killing machine that would have a significant role in Captain Britain, which isn't to suggest Moore merely recycled these concepts and characters. Due to the brevity of the original stories, there wasn't much room for development. Within Captain Britain, the full potential of the Fury and War Dog, not to mention the Special Executive, who are like the X-Men in space, are fleshed out and take on their own unique properties. David Lloyd's art style is quite pronounced and evocative in these stories. The layouts may be a tad unusual in comparison to the controlled, three-tier arrangement found in V for Vendetta. There are inserts and overlapping panels, suggesting the final layout was left up to Lloyd himself. They flow very well and feel organic, with some creative, tilted staging and dramatic lighting effects. In some ways, it is evocative of the sometimes melodramatic nature of the television show. In the end, like the Future Shock segments for 2000 AD, the Doctor Who stories are far more competent than one might expect from an emerging writer. Certainly, Moore had a fair amount of experience writing and illustrating his own work for underground publications, most of which were very short segments like the Doctor Who backup stories. However, mainstream work is a different environment and a different audience. As these stories show, Moore was quite able to adapt and display a natural skill in storytelling despite the restrictions or limitations that may have been in place. Until next time.